So can you talk a little bit about how microdosing can potentially improve people's ability to get into flow on demand?
Totally. And I would love for this to be a little bit of a back and forth conversation because you know a ton about flow. I know a decent amount about flow, but I know a lot more about psychedelics and microdosing. And it's interesting. I had the opportunity to have dinner with Stephen at a conference that we spoke at together about 5 years ago. And we started to talk about microdosing and flow. And when I told him that microdosing could be potentially useful for flow, he was surprised. And it had something to do with the neurobiological mechanisms of flow versus psychedelics. I think psychedelics are more serotonergic. There's some dopamine, there's some oxytocin, whereas the neurobiology behind flow is maybe more related to norepinephrine. And there were a couple other things in there as well. So I think my sense is it acts as a great adjunct. And that also depends a lot on the type of medicine you're using, the type of substance you're using, and the amount of the substance that you're using. And so we already talked about what is a classic microdose. What I've noticed, and we talked about psilocybin versus LSD. So let's start there. Psilocybin, because it's more serotonergic, I've found tends to be better if it's done just by itself as an adjunct for emotional regulation, as an adjunct for dropping more into the body, even as an adjunct potentially for different types of therapy. What's interesting though about psilocybin is a lot of the microdoses that are coming on the scene, if you will, are combining psilocybin with things like lion's mane, bacopa, skullcap, cordyceps. So they're actually taking the microdose of psilocybin and using it as an amplifier for these other supplements that help with neuroplasticity, that help with focus, that help with attention, that help with motivation. So I think one is if someone is really interested in psilocybin, my sort of perspective would be if you're looking to utilize microdosing for flow state, to choose a psilocybin supplement that is combined with other herbs, functional mushrooms that really help with that more sort of dopaminergic lens or orientation. Whereas with LSD is really interesting because LSD is more dopaminergic. And we know that dopamine is tied to focus, attention, and motivation, all of which are part of, I would say, the subjective experience of flow, right? You're kind of in that, you're in the focus, but yeah, you're in the zone, you're in the focus, motivation is just moving through, attention is sort of there and present. It's challenging, it might be a little more creative. And so I find with LSD that doing a microdose at the lower threshold of maybe 10 to 15 micrograms, what's key about this, Tori, is to not just do a microdose and go, okay, yeah, I think I'll work on that paper, or yeah, I think I might play an instrument, but to actually be intentional about setting up that day. So let's say someone is like, okay, I'd really like to utilize a microdose of LSD to enter into a flow state. Well, then set up the day in such a way where you're like, okay, I'm going to set aside a 2-hour gap in my morning calendar. I'm going to microdose at 8 a.m. on an empty stomach. I'm going to do maybe 10 to 15 to 20 minutes of, could be transcendental meditation after that to sort of start to get in that focused mindset. And then I'm going to queue up a creative task, maybe that I've been procrastinating on. Maybe it's working on a book. Maybe it's writing out a strategy that you're going to share with your team. I'm going to set aside a 2-hour gap. I'm going to block out everything and just utilize the energy of that LSD microdosing to go deep and dive in. And what I've noticed is it's like a flow plus, where it's like when we get into flow, maybe every now and then there's a little kind of like, what about this? Like little distractions. And what I've noticed with LSD is it just allows for absolutely full immersion as long as that structure of the container is really well held and really well set. Because the risk with adding microdosing into something like that is if you get distracted, you get really distracted. With that extra energy, it's really important to have a tight structural container to keep the energy focused in.